What happens when you feel invisible in your own life? Clara stood before her easel, brush in hand, staring at the blank canvas before her. The quiet hum of her studio, bathed in the soft morning sunlight, should have brought her peace. But instead her mind wandered. Away from the bright colors she was supposed to be mixing, away from the strokes she was meant to be making. Her thoughts drifted to Daniel, her husband of 6 years. Right now, he was probably sitting in his office, wrapped up in meetings and corporate tasks. She couldn't remember the last time he'd truly looked at her. The last time their eyes had met in a way that said more than just, "I'm here," before he rushed off to work. The last time they'd shared a moment that felt real, emotionally or physically, felt like a distant memory. Clara had always found comfort in her art. It used to be a place where she could escape, lose herself in the colors and the shapes she created. But lately, even her art had become another way to avoid the emptiness that filled her life. She'd gotten used to the quiet loneliness in their home, the silence where Daniel's footsteps used to echo. The absence between them seemed permanent, but she still clung to the hope that one day things would change, that Daniel would return to the man she once loved. It wasn't that Daniel was a bad person, he wasn't cruel, but he had grown distant. His job, his career had consumed him. He was no longer just working for their future, his job had become his world. And Clara, it seemed, had become an afterthought. But Clara wasn't blameless either. She too had pulled away, retreating into her art and her own thoughts. She'd stopped hoping for things to get better. She'd accepted the quiet loneliness that had settled into their home as though it was simply part of their life together. And then she met Ryan. It started out innocently enough. Clara had always gone to the gym to stay in shape, a quiet retreat from her increasingly lonely life. Ryan, the personal trainer, was different from anyone she had met. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was something magnetic about him. His rugged athletic frame and tanned skin showed years of dedication to his craft. His dark eyes, focused and intense, always seemed to see more than the surface. It began with small talk, casual chats after sessions, a light joke here, a compliment there. Ryan was charming in a way that felt effortless. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt noticed, seen. When he asked her out for coffee after a workout, she didn't think twice. They sat at a quiet cafe, sipping their drinks. Ryan didn't ask her about work or about her marriage. Instead, he asked about her art, about her dreams, her passion, the things that truly mattered to her. The way he listened, the way he looked at her with genuine interest, made Clara feel like she mattered again. She hadn't realized how much she missed being seen until Ryan had done it so effortlessly. It didn't take long for the tension to build. Clara found herself thinking about him constantly. The flirtations, the stolen glances, the chemistry that simmered between them, it was undeniable. And when Ryan kissed her for the first time, it felt like a spark had ignited something deep within her. She kissed him back without hesitation. As the affair between Clara and Ryan blossomed, Clara felt a rush of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. The guilt was there, lurking in the background, but it was drowned out by the intoxicating thrill of feeling desired, of feeling alive again. Ryan was everything Daniel wasn't. He was present, passionate, and, most of all, he made her feel like she mattered. Their encounters were secret, fleeting moments stolen from the demands of everyday life. Each rendezvous, each stolen kiss felt like a piece of freedom. Freedom from the monotony of her marriage, freedom from the crushing weight of her unspoken loneliness. With Ryan, she felt seen, heard, understood. But as Clara delved deeper into the affair, her guilt began to gnaw at her. What would Daniel think if he found out? Would he even care? He had been so distant for so long that Clara had begun to wonder if he even noticed her absence. She didn't know if she could tell him the truth. And even if she did, would it matter? Meanwhile, Daniel's secrets were brewing just beneath the surface. He, too, had begun an affair, though he had kept it hidden well. Ava, one of his subordinates at work, was the other woman. She was younger than Clara, ambitious and eager to please. Daniel found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't felt in years. She made him feel alive, in a way that the staleness of his marriage could no longer provide. When Daniel began staying late at the office, Clara noticed the changes. His absence, once a silent companion, now seemed to carry a more deliberate weight. And when he began to show signs of stress, anxiety even, Clara began to wonder. Was there more to his late nights than he was letting on? But she never questioned him directly. Instead, she buried herself in her own affair, her own escape. As the weeks passed, the tension between Clara and Daniel grew palpable. Clara's guilt festered, but so did her anger. She had given so much to this marriage, had tried for so long to fix it, and yet Daniel had betrayed her in his own way. She had every right to seek solace elsewhere. But still, the lies began to weigh on her. Daniel, too, was beginning to grow suspicious. The late nights, the occasional missed call, the cryptic messages on Clara's phone. He was no fool. He started snooping, checking her phone, her messages, trying to piece together the puzzle of his wife's growing distance. And when he stumbled upon a text from Ryan, his suspicions were confirmed. But Daniel didn't confront Clara, not right away. Instead, he hired a private investigator to follow her, to document her every move. The investigator provided damning evidence. Clara's affair was real. And now Daniel's plan began to take shape. If she could betray him, then he would show her just how much it hurt. He began an affair with Ava more recklessly, the thrill of the secret becoming something he craved. But in the depths of his mind, he began plotting his revenge. The snow outside the window had begun to settle in soft drifts across the front yard, the world covered in a heavy, silent blanket. Inside, the atmosphere felt suffocating, tighter than ever. Clara had just returned from a whirlwind encounter with Ryan, her pulse still racing from the exhilaration of being held and kissed with a ferocity she hadn't known in years. She was trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the illicit thrill of their affair. The last thing she expected as she entered her home was the sight of Daniel sitting at the dining table, his dark eyes cold, his posture rigid. The room was eerily silent, and Clara's stomach twisted in a way it never had before. She closed the door quietly behind her, but Daniel didn't even flinch. His focus was entirely on her, his gaze sharp and unwavering. For a brief moment, she wondered if he'd found out, if he knew about Ryan. But how could he? She had been so careful, so secretive, and yet there he was, waiting, his expression already filled with a dark certainty. "Clara," he said, "we need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. She could already feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, heavy and ominous. She forced herself to remain calm, though inside, her chest was tightening. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that stirred beneath the surface. Several weeks later, Ray came downstairs again, but this time he was armed with a tarp, and Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, as though trying to read the hidden layers of her expression, the ones she had been so careful to mask. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, with a deliberate pause, he spoke again. his words colder than ever. "About your affair," he said, his tone flat, emotionless. Clara froze. The words felt like a slap in the face. She was unprepared for the directness of it, the brutal clarity in his voice. For a second, it didn't feel real, like this was some kind of nightmare that she would wake up from any second. But the truth of it hit her like a cold, hard punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let herself show panic. She could feel her pulse racing, her mind scrambling for a way out of this. Was he bluffing? Was it possible he didn't really know the full extent of it? She quickly tried to compose herself, the shock fading into a cold mask of indifference. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though her voice wavered just slightly. Daniel stood up slowly, pushing his chair back with a screech that made her jump. He walked toward her with deliberate steps, his movements slow but menacing. There was something different about him now, a controlled anger, as if he were savoring the moment. "I know, Clara. I've known for a while," he said, his voice low and threatening. "All the late nights, the strange texts. You think I haven't noticed?" Clara's mind raced. She had been so careful, hadn't she? The texts she'd deleted, the calls she missed just to avoid suspicion. But Daniel had noticed. Daniel always noticed. "Daniel, you don't understand," she began, her voice trembling slightly as the words left her mouth. "You've been what?" he interrupted, his voice rising now, the tension crackling between them. "Bored? Lonely? You think that justifies what you've done?" His eyes were furious, burning with an anger she hadn't seen in years. Clara's heart was pounding now. She could feel the walls closing in on her. Her chest was tight, suffocated by the weight of her guilt, the overwhelming sense of inevitability. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's expression didn't soften. "You don't get to justify this, Clara," he said, his voice ice cold. "I know who he is. Ryan, right?" He spat the name, as though it tasted foul in his mouth. "You think you can just throw me away and move on with him?" Clara opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her thoughts were spinning out of control, and for the first time in a long time she realized she had no answers. She hadn't thought about what Daniel would say, about what his reaction would be when he inevitably found out. All she had been thinking about was Ryan, about the intense, intoxicating emotions he made her feel. But now, facing the destruction of her marriage, she couldn't find the right words. Before she could say anything, the doorbell rang, loud and sudden, breaking the tension between them. Clara's heart nearly leapt out of her chest. She knew who it was without a doubt. Ryan. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he followed her gaze toward the door. There was no mistaking the look of recognition in Daniel's eyes. He knew. The realization settled like a heavy stone in Clara's stomach. She rushed to the door, almost too quickly, but as her hand reached for the doorknob, Daniel's voice stopped her. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. Clara's blood ran cold. She turned back to face him, her mind in a panic. "Please, Daniel, don't!" But it was too late. Ryan had already opened the door. He stood there, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway, his eyes flicking from Clara to Daniel, sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. "Clara?" he said cautiously, stepping into the threshold. "Is everything—" Before he could finish, Daniel's fist shot out, connecting with Ryan's jaw in a brutal, shocking motion. Ryan staggered back, caught off guard by the force of the blow. Clara screamed, her body moving instinctively toward Ryan, but it was too late. Daniel lunged at him again, fury taking over his rational mind. "Get away from her!" Daniel roared, his voice filled with rage. Ryan fought back, pushing Daniel away with all his strength, but Daniel was relentless. The two men collided again, this time with more force. The struggle was raw and savage, fueled by anger, jealousy, and the growing realization that Clara's betrayal had shattered everything. Clara watched in helpless horror, frozen by the violence unfolding before her eyes. In the chaos, Clara's vision blurred as she reached out toward them. She couldn't think, she couldn't process, all she could do was react. She grabbed the first thing she could find, one of the kitchen knives, and without thinking, she drove it into Daniel's side. The blade cut through his flesh with sickening precision. Daniel gasped in shock, stumbling back from Ryan, the knife buried deep in his side. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling in a way that made Clara's stomach lurch. His breathing was ragged, shallow, blood spilled from the wound, pooling on the hardwood floor. His hand instinctively moved to the injury, but it was clear that he wasn't going to survive. Clara stood there, her hands shaking violently, her heart hammering in her chest. The reality of what she had just done, what they had both done, was beginning to sink in. She had never imagined this. She had never thought it would go this far. But now, there was no turning back. Ryan, equally stunned, knelt beside Daniel, trying desperately to stem the flow of blood. "Clara, we need to call an ambulance," he said, his voice frantic. Clara shook her head, her vision blurred with tears. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He's gone." Ryan's hands hovered over Daniel's chest, but there was nothing more he could do. The damage had been done. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, but there was no fight left in him. His lips moved in a weak whisper, his voice barely audible. "You killed me." His eyes locked on Clara, a strange mixture of betrayal and sorrow in his gaze. "I loved you, and you killed me." Clara's heart shattered as she looked down at him, the cold truth of his words seeping into her bones. She had killed him, not just with the knife, but with her actions, her choices. There was no excusing it now. She couldn't undo the damage. And then, Daniel's eyes closed for the last time. The room went silent. Ryan looked at Clara, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to go. We need to get out of here." Clara didn't respond. She couldn't. She was numb, the weight of the murder pressing down on her chest like a suffocating force. The guilt, the horror, the confusion, they all blended together, clouding her mind. Ryan grabbed her arm, his grip firm but gentle. "Clara, we need to leave. Now." But as the urgency of his voice broke through her fog, Clara realized that they were both in this together, and no matter how much she wanted to escape the nightmare they had created, there would be no running from the consequences. The blood on her hands would follow her, no matter where she went.